Hello and welcome to this tutorial on how to use the NPCs. I'm going to take a look in a little bit more depth at some of the cool things we can do with NPCs, particularly on the scripting side. I'm going to be using advanced mode in Crayta, which essentially means that you head over to the editor and then press tab to enter advanced mode. Let's get started. So I'm in advanced mode here. To add an NPC to my game, I'm going to head over to the primitives tab in the library, click NPC, and then click in my game world. I can move them around by pressing F1 and selecting the move tool or selecting the move tool, just as any other mesh or voxel mesh, and I can rotate them too. This is where they will start, their start position will be and what direction they will start looking at. But we can change those things as the game changes and the dynamics change in the game. So for example, I could make the NPC look over here, and using the new API calls that are available to us, when my player enters this trigger, I could make the NPC look at the player. So to do that, I'm going to add a script to the NPC, entity add script, new script, and it's going to be called my skeleton script. And let's enter there. Let us, and what we'll do is we'll write a function which will be called by the player entering that trigger, so we can accept the player as an argument, and then I can get hold of the NPC. Self get entity is getting hold of the NPC because this script is attached to the NPC. And then if I want to make my NPC look at the player, I can use the set look at entity command. There's two different ways of making your NPC look at a specific thing in your game world. Set look at entity, where you can pass it some kind of entity that exists, whether that's a player, a mesh, a voxel mesh, or any other entity, a light even. Or you can use set look at position, which you will need to send a specific vector, and it will just focus on that one position. Let's choose set look at entity. And then in the bracket, I'm just going to use the player, which should be sent to this function when the player enters the trigger. There's more things I can do here. I can add things like, I can add either a player, or I can add an entity, any other entity, or I can add a player and then specify a socket to look at. So could look at their head, look at their foot, could look at their hand. If you want a list of all the sockets that are available, head over to our Discord, discord.gg/Crayta, and head over to the FAQ and you'll find the full list of sockets in there. For now, I'm just going to pass in the head socket. So I'm going to ask my NPC to look at the player that's just entered this trigger and specifically look at the player's head. Now to hook it up to the trigger. NPC trigger, which I've added earlier. New binding on trigger enter. Let's put my NPC as the entity. The script will pre-select as the skeleton script. That's the only script that's on that NPC. And let's run the spot player event. So when I test this by pressing F5, my player arrives in the scene. I walk into the trigger and the NPC looks at the player. To make this a little bit spookier, let's customize our NPC. I'm going to click on the NPC and I'm going to use the customization options down here. So I can change the look of the NPC and I can change their outfit. I'm going to use the Bones outfit because I think that's a spooky enough outfit to use. If I want to, I can also attach things to the NPC. So I could attach different meshes that I find to them. I've prepared some eyes to attach to the NPC. So the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to, in my skeleton script, get hold of the entity in the game world that I want to attach to my NPC. I'm going to call this reference the eyes. The type is an entity. And then if I want to attach these eyes to the NPC, let's go to the NPC here. Now that I've saved the script, you'll see that the little input box is available for the eyes. And I'll put my glow eyes in there. Shouldn't really be glow eyes left. Should just be glow eyes. Let's rename it. And in the init function in here, I'll add those eyes to the NPC. I'm going to use the attach to, and this is a function that's already available on any entity in Crayta. And what I can do is I can attach it to this NPC, self get entity. And because the NPC inherits from the same base class that the players do, I can choose a socket. So the socket I want to choose here is head. Again, the list of sockets is available on discord.gg/Crayta in the FAQ channel. So when the game is initialized, my eyes should be attached to my skeleton. Something a little bit spookier about having a skeleton with some glowing eyes. But that's not all we can do. We can do a lot more. So we've got our skeleton looking at us. Why don't we make it so that the skeleton starts to walk towards us? So let's position it a little bit further away. When it spots the player, I want it to look at the player and then wait for a second before it starts to walk towards us. So I can use the schedule for that. After it's waited for 3 seconds, I want the skeleton to start to walk towards where the player was when they entered the trigger. This function's called when the player enters the trigger. So to get hold of that location, I just need to get hold of the position of the player. So I could do self get entity, which gets hold of the NPC, move to position. Notice when I type move to position, I've got a few different options here. I could choose a vector, which are these starting positions. So I need the vector of the position in the game world that I want. And then I've got some other options, such as the movement mode. And this is where I can use 1 to make my NPC walk, 2 to make them run, or 3 to make them sprint. I can also do a completion callback. So once the entity gets to that point in the game world, or fails to get to that point completely, it will call that callback. Get started. Let's just get hold of the player's position at this point. And I want my NPC to walk menacingly. So I'm going to choose 1 for walk. Let's save that and let's see what happens. So if I walk into the trigger, so the NPC spotted me and now it's walking menacingly towards that point. It's worth bearing in mind that there's no A-star pathfinding algorithm here. The NPC can move to a specific point. If there's anything that stops it, i.e. it can't jump over a river or it can't pass through a wall, if there's something in the way, eventually it won't be able to get to that point and it will stop trying. So it's kind of a dumb NPC. It will walk towards a place or run towards a place, but you need to manage how it handles specific use cases. Let's say, for example, I had a treasure chest. Let's say, for example, I use the brig, the jail. And my NPC is in a jail. So I've put my NPC in a jail. What happens now when I try and move the NPC to where the player was when they entered the trigger? It walks to this point where it stops. So it knows it can't pass through this mesh, and so it stops trying. Notice that it will continue to look at me because that hasn't stopped. It's still looking at my player's head, but it will walk towards me. Similarly, if I take one of these walls away, so now technically it can get to me. But let's say, just for argument's sake, we have 2 jail cells. So technically, this skeleton could walk all the way around there to get to me. But let's see what happens. So when I enter the trigger, it looks at me, it walks towards me, but it can't get to me, and again it stops. And this is what we mean when we say the NPC does not have pathfinding. Notice that even though I'm now very much reachable by the NPC, it's already given up trying to get to that initial position, and so it won't try and walk to me. Managing the state of the NPC is kind of up to you as a game programmer. So I can walk into that trigger, and it will start to walk towards me. But there's definitely going to be times when the NPC state needs to be carefully thought about when you're coding your game. Let's see what else we can make the NPC do. So rather than it walking towards me, let's comment that out for now. I can also get it to walk towards me, wait for half a second, and then let's see if we can make it roll. So enter the trigger, it sees me, starts to walk towards me, and then it rolls. So there's a whole bunch of different actions you can use here. You can use roll, you can also make it jump. Let's also do a wait and wait for another 2 seconds. And then let's make it crouch. Set crouching to do that. And a true or false, true. Let's move it a bit further away now because it's got a bit more journey. So you can see the NPC over there. So when I enter the trigger now, it looks at me, it walks towards me, it jumps, starts crouching, and it stops there. That's where it's looking, because it's looking at that specific position. So there's a whole load of different things we can get our NPC to do, and that's a really fun thing to do if, for example, you wanted to have low areas, so maybe some boxes, this, that it needed to crouch under. Let's make it do the limbo. Firstly, I'm going to check that that's doable. Yep, I can walk under there. So, and let's move that trigger. And let's make it so now it doesn't just walk towards me, but it also crouches. So let's get rid of that jump. And essentially we can make a little assault course for it and then tell it what to do. So when I walk into this trigger, it looks at me, it walks towards me, and now it crouches. And it will go under that there. But there's a slightly better way to do this. So rather than it crouching, using a timer like that, we could do something like grab hold of a trigger from our primitives menu, and then add that to the game world. Let's make it big enough that it will capture the NPC. If it's going to try and go into this. And let's add a NPC crouch script. And what we'll do here is have a function and we test what entity entered here. So if other is a NPC, is a character NPC, then other, tell it to crouch here, set crouching true. So rather than set it to crouch in here in a schedule using timings, using delays and waits and things like that, I can make it so that when an NPC enters this trigger, it crouches. Let's hook that up on trigger enter. We can also do something like same bit of code, but change entered to exited, and we'll hook this up and set crouching to false, which means when it leaves the trigger, it should stand up. Let's test that out. So when I enter the trigger, the NPC looks at me, it walks towards me, enters that trigger and crouches, it exits that trigger and stands up. And we've started to get some quite interesting and complex behaviors that make it feel and look quite realistic. Now another thing you might want to do is maybe set it up so that it, on a loop, checks where the player is and constantly walks towards that position. You could do that every couple of seconds. And that might make it feel like it's homing. Then it's a case of managing your game environment so that you're thinking about what happens when an NPC enters a certain area near a certain obstacle. Do they dodge it? Does this force them to stay there? Do they get stuck? What happens to the NPC? So this is a first pass of NPCs, and it's really exciting because there's lots of interesting and complex behaviors that you can cause your NPC to have by using just triggers and managing their state a little bit. One final thing I should add is if you want your NPC to emote, we can add a property and the type is an emote asset. When I add that to the skeleton script on the NPC, notice that my emote has now been added to the skeleton script and I can choose an emote. If I want the skeleton to play that emote when the player is spotted, rather than moving the skeleton towards my player, let's just take the skeleton, put it already quite close, and self get entity. Rather than moving it, let's play emote. Refer to the property we set up there by emote, and let's try that out. Save, F5 to preview. So now I enter the trigger, the NPC looks at me and starts emoting rather than doing a spooky walk crouch thing. So much fun. And this is just one NPC, right? As soon as you start filling your game with more NPCs, some of these complex behaviors that we've been looking at, your game world really comes alive. It adds so much. And it means that you can add these things in your game that you might be able to interact with. They might tell you a story. Just their mere presence tells you a story. This world is now populated with other things. What does that mean for your game? What could it mean for your future games? Really exciting. I hope this has been an interesting and useful tutorial in the first steps in using NPCs in your game in Crayta.